This is Hajra. I've got my little bunny here, and last time we did some great pointillism with gouache. This time I'm going to be using watercolor pencils. So I've got my bunny here. He's got wings. I think this would make a really nice Valentine's Day piece, but if you're not really into Valentine's Day, it's a great storybook piece instead of just using every color in your palette and every color in your box to just pick out a few colors and give yourself some real mood. Now I've got these 5 colors here, and they are phthalo green or dark phthalo green. I've got emerald green. I've got light green. Got red violet. And I have magenta. Now you might know that red and green are complements, which means that they are across from each other on the color wheel. And the reason I chose magenta and a few of these greens are they're sort of near complements or split complements. So it'll give you a little bit of a different mood than just red and green, which sometimes looks a little bit too Christmassy. And the reason I chose green is because there's foliage in this piece, and the reason I chose magenta is because I wanted to make the bunny have sort of like pinkish wings, but not really go towards pink, which I think is a little bit too feminine sometimes. I'm going to start right in on this little wings. Margaret Wise Brown wrote a really lovely picture book a long time ago. I believe it was in the 60s, called The Runaway Bunny. It's one of my favorite picture books. It has sort of an allegory for love and life and death, or it's just a bunny story, depending on how you read it. And what I really like about The Runaway Bunny is that it's for kids and it's for adults, and so I thought there's a little black and white illustration in the book with the little bunny with wings and leaves, and I just wanted to do my own version of it. So this is my own bunny modeled after The Runaway Bunny. And I'm just going to draw in with a watercolor pencil, and all you have to do if you're really nervous about wet paint is probably just buy yourself some watercolor pencils, because nothing can be easier than just drawing with color pencils if you're scared of paint. And that's because we've been using color pencils of some sort since we've been in kindergarten school, so it's a very nice, dry, comfortable way to get going. And one of the things that I really like about these watercolor pencils is that they saturate very well. Now you don't want to press in too hard. If you press in too hard, you will end up getting these sort of harsh lines in the paper that won't blend out. If you're going for that, then that's fine, because sometimes you might want some more texture. But if you don't want texture, if you want it to blend, then just try to use a very soft hand. I'm using Hot Press Arches watercolor paper here, and this does not come in a postcard size, but I've cut it slightly larger than a postcard size from a watercolor pad that I had. And I usually have blocks, but I do buy watercolor pads sometimes too. And I have found that Arches works the best because the hot press, the cold press, the rough, all of them, just not comparable to anything else. I'm going to take some of my water and I'm going to wet this right off the bat, and you can see that these lines will saturate and bleed like watercolor. And you do have a choice of control, so that means the more water I use, I could totally obliterate these lines, and the less water I use, and if I stick in the shape that I put it down, I will be able to keep the shape and the line somewhat. Again, this is Arches Hot Press, and the side of the paper that I'm using has a little bit of an eggshell finish. It's got like teeny tiny grainy textures that feel sort of like the surface of an eggshell. And I like using the eggshell side, and I also just like hot press better than cold press or rough, is because sometimes you don't want the texture to show up in your scans. And if you use hot press, you'll have almost no texture. Versus if you end up using cold press or rough, cold press has texture, rough has even more texture, so you're kind of stuck with a lot of texture in your scans. And that's great if you're doing a landscape or if you really want to signal that you're doing a watercolor piece. But suppose you're scanning something and you just don't want that paper texture in there, the dimples and everything that show up in watercolor paper, then hot press is the way to go. But you can see how this has made a really lovely, nice watercolor texture. And I can go back in there and add a few more lines to make value depth. Suppose I want to make it darker, then I can just go right back in. And because the paper is a little bit wet, it's already sort of melting into the paper, which is what happens with watercolor pencils if you use them on damp paper, is that they sort of just melt into the paper. This is great, by the way, if you have trouble with hair and if you have trouble with fur. then easier than using a brush to paint fur or hair is watercolor pencils. And I've painted hair and fur with a brush, but anytime I paint it with a watercolor pencil, I always ask myself why I don't just do that all the time, because it's so much easier. And if you want to keep your piece a pure watercolor, then these are good pencils to use. Certain organizations that accept watercolor pieces in contests, that this is considered to be watercolor. It's not considered to be color pencil or wax or gouache or anything else like that. So I've got one wing done. And my goal for this time around really was that I wanted to get the whole piece done on air, because I've chosen longer pieces in the past and they are hard to get done. So I do think I'll be getting like smaller pieces out in the future. Now I'm going to go back in with the wet. And gosh, I just love the texture of this paper. It's like painting on some kind of really nice it has some catch, but such a smooth, like, sort of like if you're a ceramics person at all, if you've ever done any raw clay pieces that haven't been fired yet and they haven't been glazed yet, it's this paper, the Hot Press Arches watercolor paper, and this is 140 pound, but I think you can get it heavier too, and 300 pound. It feels like working or painting on top of like a dried clay, but not fired and not glazed. So it's got this like lovely catch, but also very smooth, and it feels very satisfying. That's the best way I can think of to describe it. So the other thing I'm interested in doing now is I want to work on his face first, because I have a philosophy where if you screw up the face, you can start over, right? But because of course if you screw something up too much, you do have to start over. But if you do the face very later on, then what'll end up happening is that you'll have a lot of the other parts of the piece done, and then you'll mess up on the face and then decide whether or not you can save the face or just give up and move on. But you don't want to end up doing the face so late that if you happen to mess up, that you're sort of stuck with it. So I try to do the face rather early on, and it also makes you braver for the rest of the piece, because frankly, once you're done with the face, everything else is going to be a lot easier, because the face is the stressful part. And then after that, you can just have fun. So I'm going to try to do his nose here and bring it down. And again, look at the teeny little lines I can make with this, and they sort of stick as long as I don't put a lot of water down. And you might have a little bit of trouble seeing what I'm doing with his nose and his face, but the rest of it's going to be bigger than this. So you can see that color and that color, and they're almost the same, and I'll saturate them so you can see the difference. So that's the red violet, and that's the magenta, and this is just basically just pinker, and that one's a little bit more purple. They're fused, so I remember reading that when I bought them, is that if you drop them, then you're not going to end up breaking the lead inside of the barrel, because they've done something to make it fuse. Now you can see I'm going not in a straight line like my sketch, but going in little hairy jumps, little spikes and gibs, so that my bunny has fur and not a straight line, because he's not a plastic bunny, right? Even though we kind of drew him like a plastic bunny. And such a lovely character that she wrote in this book that I'm basing this bunny on. He was, I don't know what I did with his feet here, they're like little stumpy feet, but I think I'll bring them forward a bit, just so he's got some real feet. And I think it's because I was trying to be simple and made some really simple feet, but I think that he can have slightly more real feet than those little things that I drew. So, and again, this is a nice creamy pencil. Love these colors. I love these serene colors. I've said this before last time. So I think if you really want to calm yourself down, get yourself some serene colors out instead of like some really angry colors. Like red or orange. Don't choose those colors if you want to calm down. You can choose some really nice soft and serene colors like a minty green or sea blues or ocean blues, and teals and turquoises, purples, lavenders. They're all very, very calming. Got a lovely coolness to them. So, and I'm just drawing little fuzzy hair. I'm not quite sure how much this will saturate down, and I don't want to make it too even, so I think I'm going to go back and try to make sure it's not too even. And just draw variegated hair strokes, just little lines and also some V's here and there. So straight lines and some V's. Very easy, very simple. If you've done any kind of chibi or manga anime drawings, this is going to be very, very easy for you. And if you're a beginner, this is another good piece to start with because he's just a simple little bunny. Not too much going on. I sort of did a fat bunny. I've tried the Fabriano paper. I did it for the last few videos, and it does have a lot of obvious texture in it. The cold press is a little bit more textured than the hot press. And I've used cold pressed arches, and it saturates better than the Fabriano. So I know some people are big fans of the Fabriano, but I think arches really does a great job with whatever they do for their sizing and also for however they flatten out these papers, because they get them just right. I have to remind myself that I have to do pointillism for the leaves. In fact, let me go in and draw some circles, because that's what pointillism is. Now the real difference between pointillism and stippling is if you do stippling, like with a pencil or with a pen, then you're doing it with one color, like the ink that you're working with or the graphite that you're working with. Whereas if you do pointillism, so stippling is one color and pointillism is using a lot of colors, using the paint to make dots, and that's pointillism. And these are used interchangeably at this point, these terms, but that's the official clarification for anybody who's interested, is that stippling is for one color, like if you're just using the ink, and pointillism is for using paint to make dots. Water, I think it sort of eats up the dots. It does sort of eat up the dots. I think what I want to do is I just wet this leaf. I'm going to go back and throw in some, oh yeah, those wet dots look much better. So just to let you know, something I just figured out is if you want to do pointillism with the watercolor pencils, if you want to do some great watercolor looking pointillism, then wet the paper first and then come back in and dot with the watercolor pencils. It looks absolutely gorgeous. And it's like dotting with an ink marker when it's wet. It dabs right on there. And then even when you use the brush, make sure you dab. Dab, dab, dab. So if you want to keep that pointillized. I'm also going to come back with a little bit of this kneaded eraser and get rid of the pencil lines around here. Oops, that was a Runaway pencil. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a little bit more texture down here and then get rid of my pencil lines around here. The great thing about watercolor pencils is they actually don't erase with normal erasers, especially a light touch kneaded eraser. So you can erase your pencil lines underneath and around a watercolor pencil drawing, but you won't lose the watercolor pencil. So anybody who wants to do that can do that. It is a nice thing to know, especially if you're working with, I've known people to use watercolor pencils underneath oil paintings or acrylic paintings because you don't have any graphite line left, so you can just use the watercolor pencil as your drawing pencil and then not have to erase anything because it's water soluble and it will disappear right into your painting. So there's some nice benefits to using watercolor pencils. They are, depending on what brand you get, can be somewhat expensive, but it depends on the light fastness. So these Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils are really, really light fast, which is a nice thing to have if you're doing little pieces. You know, they're not going to just be fugitive, not criminal, but not disappearing in colors. Coming in and just dabbing in places. Dabbing strokes are really useful in a lot of places actually, and you end up having a lot more control when you dab and poke versus if you just come in and just scrub at everything with the water. It lets you almost mold the watercolor versus just letting it run everywhere. And a lot of watercolor is about freedom, but in case you're in a situation where you do want to control where it's going more for a smaller space or just for a tighter drawing, then you know how to do that. And if you want it to bleed, on the other hand, you can just go ahead and throw some water in everywhere. Kind of feel like he's not as round back here as he should be. Don't know if it's because, I think it's because the leaf ended up blocking him, but I'm going to come back in and also do his little tail, and that'll help with the, you see how it's touching the parts where it's wet, there's a lot of color. to be careful about that because sometimes you can't really blend that in. I think my favorite color schemes recently have been complementary color schemes, and it's because they're not as simple as just choosing a triad of red, yellow, and blue, and they are limited, but they're also just two colors. So as long as you pick two colors, you've got your mood. Now, of course, apart from the two colors, if you mix the mud in between them, which is, shadows, then you can actually, instead of using it in places where you don't want it, that's when you call it mud. If it's in places where you do want it, you call it neutralized colors or shadows. So that's an important thing to realize, is that if you have two colors, it's not just the two colors, it's all the shadow mixes that you can make in between. So I think I like that better now. I do think I'll try to make his. Also, once you've made your color choices ahead of time and know the limits and the boundaries of your colors, you can really have some fun doing the drafting and the shading and the values instead of just focusing on trying to judge where the colors are going to go. So it helps divide up the drawing and painting process, especially if you're new to painting and you don't want to be thinking about values and color all at the same time. If you do all of this color mixing on a little scrap piece of paper ahead of time, then you can have a little wheel of lovely colors. It shows your entire color map for the piece. And you can already see some optical mixing going on with those scribbles, but I'm gonna wet them. So I've got these as the pure colors, and then I've got these as the mixed colors. And this is not a watercolor paper, this is just like a cardboard, so you're not going to see the saturation of it. It's not going to give you the best mixes, but it does give you an idea that you can have these duller greens and duller brownish purples, and then you have the two other vibrant colors. So I really do like that pointillism leaf, and I think it's actually a great way to use watercolor pencils, and I think I might have done it a little bit in the past and then forgot about it. So I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to do it for this piece, because there's nothing like using ink for pointillism. It's really amazing. It gives you these great saturation sort of dots and stuff like that. And using watercolor pencils over damp paper gives you the same effect. So if that's something that you're trying to mimic but in color, watercolor pencil is great for that. I don't know if I should give him something to sit on. I don't know if I just want to have him sitting maybe just a little bit. A little bit of a ground shadow there. If you've ever read Watership Down, and for me, I can never get that book out of my head. Ever since I read that book and it showed all those fighting bunnies, and allegories for communism and democracy and all of that aggression going on with the bunny bucks getting away from the bad fascist bunnies. That's a term for you, fascist bunny. But I really think of them as rather much more masculine than I ever used to before I read that book. So it is a nice book to look into. And there is an animated version of that called Watership Down as well. And it's just a lovely animated piece, and it's like sort of dark in a way that animated movies no longer are. You can be really similar to colored pencil, actually. Really super similar. Because if you use them just dry, then it'll act like just a normal colored pencil. And you'll notice I have my gloves on here, and that's because I'm trying to keep my hands warm, but also I'm trying to keep myself from smudging any of this wet watercolor pencil. I love being a lefty, but I hate how I smear everything, whether it's like calligraphy or a lot of fresh sort of paint that I've just done. So I've sort of gotten into the habit of either keeping a napkin underneath my hand or a piece of paper under my hand, or just coming around and making sure that I'm wearing gloves when I'm doing something like this. Not always, but on a cold day, this is useful. On a warm day, you can just use a piece of paper, and that way you don't have to wear gloves. And these colors are pretty much the same when they get wet, so unless I used a huge amount of them, they're kind of interchangeable. Yeah, this bunny is exciting to me because he's got wings. I think of this bunny as sort of like, I don't know, almost like the black rabbit he's not black, he's purple, but in Watership Down, he doesn't have a very fierce look. At some point I do have to do like a really fierce bunny, like not a feminine bunny, but like a really fierce bunny, so that you believe me about those bunnies in Watership Down. So I think somebody somewhere has probably done a lot of art for Watership Down, and I haven't done any pieces that really are some fierce masculine bunnies, and I'd really like to at some point. just for that book, just as an homage to that book. This bunny is out of imagination, but the leaves behind him and the wings that he has are inspired by a picture in Margaret Wise Brown's very old picture book called The Runaway Bunny. So, but this bunny is my own, but his foliage background and wings is inspired by the flying bunny in The Runaway Bunny. But this is my own bunny, so there is no reference for this. But if you go to Margaret Wise Brown's book, you'll find a bunny with very similar wings, but he's like a little bit cartoonier and he's facing to the side, so my bunny's slightly more realistic despite being cartoony. Yeah, that's right, the Black Rabbit of Inlay. That's what I have to do someday, is the Black Rabbit of Inlay. But this rabbit is nowhere near a Black Rabbit of Inlay. First of all, he doesn't look like he's taken anybody's life, even if it's collecting souls for the next life. He has a very sort of startled look. You know how some of those bunnies tend to, and there's a particular look that mammals have when they're eating, right in the middle of eating, and they look up at you and they're scared and they're trying to look around to see if anybody's going to eat them. And they have a very startled look. That's the look he has right now. So he doesn't look very, very brave. Okay, I'm going to come back in with my wet watercolor pencil. And again, magic. You know what it reminds me of? Like those really cheap coloring books that used to be at the grocery store when we were kids, that my mom, by the way, never let me get because she thought they were a waste of money. But they had that sort of like, all you have to do is color with water. So you like put water on there and it gets wet and it just starts coloring. Like, just have a wet paintbrush and there's no paints that you need to buy, but you just go out and wet all the different pictures and the different parts turn into different colors based on how they've put like little dots everywhere. That's what watercolor pencils remind me of. In fact, if you were like a really sweet person and you had like a niece or a nephew, then you could actually draw a little card or even a little book if you were really generous with watercolor pencil, but not color it, not wet it, and then just tell them to color it with a paintbrush wet with water, and they would see how colors just magically start to run. I think just a little bit of a area here like bunnies have, and then I'll put in the whiskers at some point. But and bunnies, as well as other mammals, actually have these little eyebrows that we never see. They sort of point up in this direction, and I've drawn bunnies numerous times before, and so I've gotten used to the fact that they have like a little, they have their hair running in the same direction as we do. We just don't see it because it's all over them. So I'm trying to give him a little bit of eyebrow hair. It's very faint though, because I don't want his face to be overwhelmed. Might come back in later, but I think that's pretty good for now. Do think that this ear doesn't have as deep of a pocket there to show that it's the inside of the ear. This ear is turned sideways, so it doesn't have that, but this ear needs a little bit more value. And the other great thing about watercolor is it'll do things that you don't want it to do, even when you're controlling it. So it'll give you these really cool sort of for free effects that you get that you don't get with a lot of other mediums. On the other hand, it's also just harder to deal with watercolor in so many other ways, or at least people will tell you that. So it's not necessarily a positive unless you think of it as a positive. I've always thought of it as a positive though, because I feel like, okay, so his head's wet, and as a result of that, that's just dotting right in. So I don't know if I want to keep going there. So you see what happens when you put down wet pencil, is that it does that. So, oh, I feel like I've really dotted his head up. I think I might need to dab that up. I'm going to get my little filbert here and try to lift this line just a bit. It should lift mostly. Yep, there he goes. It's turning back into the bunny we know and love. And now I'm going to wait for this to dry completely before I come back and do that line for the ear and that part of the head again. Because if I come back in right now just to that area, it'll just bleed everywhere again. So, but you can see that you can lift right back up for the most part. It's only permanent if you really leave it there or if you really groove the paper. Okay, so now while we're letting the bunny rest for a bit, literally, I'm going to come in with these lovely greens, and remember what I said earlier, which is that it was really nice actually to come in with the wet brush and do pointillism. So I'm just going to wet brush pointillism on top of this leaf. He's a flying bunny, so I'd say he'd eat blossoms and apple trees, and he'd eat carrots off of the ground, and he'd do all sorts of stuff. So I don't know if you can see this now, but I'm really just dotting in these. So I'm doing the pointillism like I did last time, but this time, like I said, I wanted to use watercolor. At least for the leaves, I had that planned, and I was wondering whether or not to do it for the bunny, and that what ended up happening was I didn't end up doing it for the bunny because I enjoyed the little fur strokes too much. So see, I'm just putting down some water on the leaf in the leaf shape and then coming back with these dots, and you can see that it makes these great dots. Do you see that? And it's like using a marker. It really is like using a marker, and it'll continue to blend just a little bit because the paper is wet, and it'll make a great little pointillized effect. And once it gets to be quite a bit of pigment on there, instead of brushing on the water, pointillize water on there too. So if that makes any sense, what I mean is, like, if this leaf is empty, I can go ahead and just rub the water on like that. But once I have a lot of dots on there, I don't want to rub the dots out, so I go in dot water in after that. I think I like the pointillism better actually with the watercolor pencils than I did with the brush, because it gives you a perfect dot in comparison, and it's actually still watercolor, but it gives you a perfect dot, especially at this teeny scale versus worrying about the brush. But I mean, definitely it would be a lot faster if you were using a bigger painting to use a brush, which is what we did for the Eiffel Tower piece, which, by the way, I shamefully haven't completely completed, and I need to complete that so I can show you that during the next stream at some point. Strathmore paper. I used Strathmore in high school and in middle school, and afterward I bought some Arches watercolor paper when I was in college, like after I was done graduating college and I wanted to get back to painting. So I got it like when I was around 22, 23, but it took me like, I don't know, maybe like another 2 years before I was brave enough to use my Arches watercolor paper. I had it sitting around in a block like, this is beautiful and expensive and I can't bear to use it. So, and then once I finally broke into it, what I did actually, and maybe this isn't the best idea, but what I did is I bought myself another block of Arches watercolor paper, so I didn't feel like it was just the one block that I had. And then I finally opened the first block. And eventually you have to come to the conclusion of what's more special than you using this right now, because otherwise you'll never justify using it if you're that kind of person. And I think even if you're the kind of person that's using your Arches watercolor paper for everything, even if it's like teeny tiny, not very important things, I admire those people more than people who just sit on their art supplies, because I used to be one of those people that just sat around and didn't use stuff. And it was basically just a waste of my time, because the nicer paper I had works a lot better. One of the comments I got on YouTube at some point was somebody telling me that, because I had said about something like, oh, I don't want to use these art supplies because these pencils are really nice or something, and their response had been that their mom had passed away and she had all of her mom's supplies, and her mom was an artist, but she didn't use a lot of her things because she was saving them, and now her mom was gone and a lot of her stuff was still unused. So she told me, make sure you use your stuff, because you don't want to be, it makes me sad to think my mom had all this stuff and she could have used it. And she said her favorite thing from her mom was actually some set of, I think, either oil pastels or something like that she'd opened up and had been like ground down and used almost all the way. And she said she felt really happy when she saw that, because she saw that her mom had done something with those and had been artistic and had fulfilled her need to create. We always think as artists the most beautiful thing is a new pack of, color pencils or a new box of paints. I know I always feel that way, but I think to a lot of people, once they get older, a more beautiful thing would be a used up box of paints instead of just a new box of paints. What I've done here is I've added just a very, very simple few blossoms, and it's because I don't want the bunny to be the only purple. I think I've said this before about color harmony and adding it actually adds a lot of verisimilitude, basically, because in real life you'll have reflections of other colors in a surrounding environment. So we kind of subconsciously expect to see a color in different places and not just in one place when we're looking at even just a picture like this where there are no reflections and it's not very real. So that's why it always rings more true if you put colors into more than one place in a piece. And it's not guaranteed that that's going to make a piece. Sometimes you can have a spotlight color, but you definitely can help your chances of making your piece look less awkward if there is a risk of that if you use color in more than one place. And then go back in with the brush. Use the side. Remember I said that last time? This is a sable brush that I'm using. It's a Da Vinci 0, and I don't want to use the tip of it. It'll just make the hair all frayed and blunt, so use the side of the brush when you dab. And I dab a lot, so that's very important. I also scrub a lot because I lift things. Try not to do a lot of my lifting with my watercolor brushes because, especially the sable ones is what I mean by watercolor brushes, because obviously I've got nylon synthetics that you can lift all day with, but don't want to do that with your sable brushes because you'll just fray that hair. That hair will just get frayed, just like your real hair gets frayed from being rubbed around and get split ends. You're going to give the watercolor brush frayed and split ends, and then you'll have wasted your money. So, because unlike your hair, this hair is not going to grow back. The good thing about painting with smaller brushes, I mean, I've got bigger size brushes too, but I tend to stick with a lot of detail brushes because I like small stuff. And what you can do is, well, the smaller brushes just aren't that expensive, whether you get them in sable or whatever, you know. Really large sable brushes are going to be expensive because they've got more hair in them. I've got my light green, and if I have an edge here, for example, that's meeting up with a lot of the other greens, you know, then I want to make sure that it's a dark edge so it looks different than the lighter edge it meets up with, so you can tell it's a new leaf. And again, come back in and stipple my paint right in. It was fun doing that new Impressionist piece last time. I hope you check out the edited down video on YouTube. Georges Seurat and Paul Signac, and how they basically pioneered pointillism. I found watercolor pencils are really, really fun for thumbnails too. So whether you're doing a small piece or like thumbnails, you can use watercolor pencils because they'll give you all the look of watercolor in a really teeny space with a lot more control. So that's another idea. So I think if I wanted to use something dry, I'd use the cheaper actual colored pencil. Try to do a few leaves that have a little bit more of the yellow in it, just so we can have some warmth in a few areas. And going back in and layering like this on damp paper will make it more saturated, and you can play with your values. It's a lot more controlled than just sitting there with pigment in a tube or pigment in a pan that you have to construct lines with the brush. With this, you can construct lines with the pencil, which is a lot more intuitive to a lot of people who are just starting out. And it'll always be more intuitive, actually, just to everybody, because we've used pencils way more than we're gonna hold a brush. So a brush doesn't exactly signal control to us, you know. I mean, I've used brush a lot and done some drawing even with a brush when you're doing a lot of the details and molding all the stuff. Sometimes you do just about all of your drawing in a picture with a brush, but a pencil is still more control. So I feel like these leaves down here don't really look lighter, like more yellow. They just look actually lighter, like they're not as saturated, even though they're quite heavily saturated. John Hurt, who was a very great actor and had an amazing voice in particular. He wasn't the most handsome dude, but he had this amazing voice that had this like gravelly texture to it, but also very regal. He died last week, and he did the voice for Hazel in Watership Down, so he was the lead rabbit in that book I was talking about. So you might have noticed on my Facebook page I posted one of my other bunny paintings and gave a little tribute to Mr. John Hurt. As soon as you give something a face, whether it's a person or an animal, it becomes a lot more interesting to paint and a lot more interesting to watch be painted than something that has no face. You don't want him to look mean, you don't want him to look hard, and you don't want the features to be out of place. You know, how he ends up looking more like a hamster, not like a bunny or something like that, you know. So yeah, those are the things you have to watch out for at this size. because you can't do very much else. You can't do like some huge amount of detail in his eyes or in his nose. I think one of the lessons that every artist has to learn is when to stop, and it's harder to learn if you're a digital painter because you can keep undoing and redoing like I was talking about last time. But I think it's not just about knowing when to commit. It's also that sometimes when you keep going, you mess a painting up. Like you have a perfectly good painting, and then you do a few more things because you're just going and you're in the mood, and then the next thing you know, you've ruined your piece that was perfectly good just a while ago. So he's got a sort of earnest, startled expression. That's how I would describe what his face looks like. This part right here is bleeding. The leaf is bleeding, so I'm lifting it just with a damp brush. And I've got my nylon filbert, like I said, and I'm just dabbing at that. I'm also going to dry this area out a bit because anytime you have a lot of wet, it'll leak right back into that area, so hopefully that'll stick. If you go back and re-wet stuff and re-add these dots, it really just makes these cool sort of, looks almost like ferns. You know how you have those leaves and ferns that have like that weird speckled quality to them? It looks almost like that. But yeah, these watercolor pencils are really creamy. Now I'm not being cheap, it's actually the truth. Once the shavings come out of the top, get rid of the wood shaving part of it, but keep the color part of it and save it. You can sprinkle that into other paintings as color effects and stuff. Of course, every time you sharpen these, you will lose a little bit of it. And I found that you can actually save that part of it. I don't think it's being cheap, I think it's being frugal. So I think that actually is something that you also have to be if you want to invest in good artist supplies. Really like the texture going on here. I think it really is a much more exciting than if I had just stroked these leaves in, especially because this piece is not complicated. Texture is always your friend. It doesn't matter if you're doing a realism piece or not, but especially if you're not doing a realism piece, the texture can be something that adds detail in a very sort of unplanned and easy way. Grisaille painting videos that I did on YouTube took off so much. The idea of separating your painting into values and colors instead of doing the values and colors at the same time is very enlightening to me, especially if you're doing a complicated piece, a very complicated piece. Then it's a lot easier to do your values first and then do your colors later. So you have got, you know, two completely separated steps for the value and color. Whereas what I'm doing right now, because this is simple, is I've got no separate value layer. It's going from light to dark in just the color. There is no gray underneath all of this. I wonder if any of you guys are going to do any kind of pointillism at all. I've done a portion of this piece in pointillism and definitely not all of it. The other great thing about this is that instead of having to use many different sized brushes for this, because I used the watercolor pencils, I only have the one brush tomorrow or the day after. Look at stuff with a fresh eye. Scan it and look at it on your computer. Turn it upside down. Look at it in a mirror. Look at it far away. Look at it close up. Squint your eyes so you see just the values. You'll end up seeing a lot of cool new information about your piece. We definitely know he eats berries now because he's got a lot of berries around him. Some more saturated berries on this side to match with the intensity of that side. Don't want to have such dark purple just on one side of the piece. Let me blend these out a little bit. Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of purple and put it right there too, because like I said, I think I liked the shadow color there. So I liked that, so I'm going to go ahead and put a few dots just right here. I'm going to put a little leaf down here. And it's all pointillismed out. And I'm going to suck up the extra water. So I hope you guys like that. That is a near complimentary bunny with wings and some foliage, and he's done in magenta, red, violet, phthalo green, light green, and emerald green, I believe. And this is the Albert Dürer watercolor pencils. And I just wanted to do a quick mixed pointillism with watercolor piece today and managed to get that done. Somebody says they're selling the virgin white piece, but well, I hope you got a lot of money for it because I'm expecting royalties. Alright, so I'm gonna say bye. formally. I'll see you guys later. Thanks for tuning in. I really enjoyed doing this bunny piece. Join me next time and subscribe to my channel. Epic painting adventures to everybody, and I'll see you guys next time.